In this video, let's look at adding a date of joining property for the priest entity and why we have to make it nullable, or why is it preferred to make it nullable. Now this is a fairly simple concept but largely misunderstood. So I thought I'll bring this in and make sure you have clear idea about null and not null. So going back to our example, what I have done is I've just created a button called create priest, and inside that I'm just going ahead and creating a priest. So I'll come back to it in a while. If we look at the definitions for, let's start with prasadam. If you see, most of the properties are not null. So all the C hash properties which you have here are translated into a not null. So basically it means in database you have to send some value to it. Okay. Except this name here. So generally strings are by default created as null. Now if you remember, the basic C hash type can hold null values also. So they have just made it as null. Whereas if you think about all other types, whether it is decimal, whether it is an integer, or whether it is a boolean, they implicitly have some default values and they cannot hold null. You can try it out. If you just try to assign unit price equals null on any entity, it will say no, you cannot do that because unit price is not nullable. And that is the reason when this entity is translated into an actual table, most of the properties are not null except the name, because name can inherently hold null values. You can try to do that. Prasadam.name is equal to null. You could do that, but you wouldn't want to do that in the business sense. Okay. And there are ways to restrict it also. Now coming back to since this is all not null, this is also not null. You know that if you do, while creating an object, if you do not pass any value for this, let's say I created a prasadam, just created a name in it and left all other things. I didn't even touch other things. I never assigned anything to their properties. So what would happen in the database? You will see the default values 0.0, or if it was an int, it was just 0. So far so good. I mean, let's not talk about the business aspect now. Let's just talk about the technical mapping between C hash and what is expected by the database. The business mapping is something you can always configure in how I've shown you to configure with the entity configurations in the previous videos. Now in this video, my main intention is to bring out the misconception of null, especially when it comes to date. Now that you have a fair understanding, if you look at the priest entity here, I have ID, name, locker number and age, and only this is null if you see, and you know why, and all other are not null, so you cannot simply push null into it. And in this, so far so good, no issues. I mean, if you leave out any of these, the default values will go and save. If you see here, intentionally while creating a priest, I am leaving out the age property. So when I run this code and if I try to save it, it should happily save it without any complaints. And if you look at the database, age will be just 0, which may not be appropriate, but no issues technically. Now let's see what happens with the date, which is what we started with discussion for. Let's say I wanted to have a property called what is it? Date of joining. Yeah, date of joining, right? So this will be called, or this would be date time, and I think it needs the system namespace. Yes. So we will call this as DOJ, which just stands for date of joining. And obviously now that I have changed the model, I'll have to go ahead and create a migration for this. So what I'll do is I'll go to package manager and I'll say add migration, and I'll say DOJ, add it, click enter. So migration is smart enough to figure out, which entities have changed and what are the properties which have changed, and create the suitable scripts for it. You don't even have to name this accordingly. You can just give it some default names, but anyway, it will just go ahead and pull the right things. And if you see here now, we got a class generated called DOJ added, which inherits the DB migration. And there is one change it has to do, which is it has to add a column DOJ in the table priests, and most importantly, nullable equals false. Yes. So remember, most of them are not null. So that's how this says nullable is false is also another way of saying not null. So not to get confused there. So basically this is not null now. Okay. And anyway, we have the migration automatically applied when our application starts. So I won't even bother about updating the database at this point. Now let's go back to my form. Let's take a look at this again. Apart from me leaving out the age, I have also left out the date of joining for this. Now is the question. Now should it complain or should it not complain? Well, if it did not complain, or if it should not complain about me leaving out age, it should neither complain about me leaving out the date of joining. But is that what happens? Let's go ahead and see. Just in case, I'll go and put a breakpoint here and start it in debugging mode. And let's wait and see what happens. So the form is now migrating our database. So it would go ahead and add, and it says ready. So far so good. So we have a database with a newly added DOJ column in the priest entity. Let's go ahead and try to create a priest and see if everything goes well. It did not, so we got an exception. So let's copy this exception message. Let me add a quick watch here only and see what the error is. And if you see the inner exception, yeah. So this is the inner exception. It says there was a out of range value. So why is this happening? I'll tell you about that. So I'll temporarily close this, and if I bring this up, now the SQL Server has a minimum value of this date, January 1st, 1753, whereas our C hash object, the default, so I'll just say C hash date time, has a default value of January 1st, 0001. So just like age, even though I left out age, it took a default value of 1 and the database was happy with it. It just went ahead and stored 1. But when I gave the default value of 11/001, I passed it to the server. He said, no, I can't hold it. It's beyond the range which I am programmed to. So that is what you see this exception for. So how do we deal with this? So we can deal with this in two ways. One would obviously be the simpler way, where I go ahead and I'll make sure that whenever I am about to create a priest object, I will always give it some value. So let's say we are entering this priest into the database, and today is his joining day. I'll go ahead and do that. So if I do this now, I should not have any problem. If you run this, it will happily run and the data will also be created. But what if I wanted to have the flexibility of not bothering with this DOJ, just like I did not bother with age or any other optional properties? So how I would handle that would be to come to our priest entity and make this a nullable type. Right? So now what happens is, when I do not give or when I do not assign anything to the date of joining, instead of passing the default value, my C hash will pass a null value, and database has no issues. It can happily accept null values as well, but not at this stage. Because if you see at this stage, you have, let me refresh this. You have a DOJ which is not null. So basically that's what it follows. So I'll need another migration. So what I'll say, package manager, and I'll say add migration. DOJ can be null. Give it something so that it could be easily understandable. So I'll wait for the entity framework to create the migration script for me. Once it is done, it should open here. So it did open the DOJ can be null. If you just see, it is altering the column. So initially it was not null. Now if it did not say anything, that means it is nullable. Because if you see the other way around, when if you see any other migrations, typically it would be nullable false. But when you just omit that in this Fluent API, let's go to the DOJ. DOJ added, DOJ can be null. Yes. So it just taken off that constraints of nullable false. So now it can be nullable. Okay. So now let's run the application once and try to create the priest again, but this time we should not be seeing any errors. So I'll start it in debug mode just in case there is an exception. Now it is migrating our columns. It is ready. And just to make sure that our database is still in good shape, so I'll just say okay. Now I'll try to create a priest. It should say added. Yes, even though we have left out. So if I come here to my form1.cs, so if you see here, I have not given anything for the date of joining, but still it went ahead and added it. And if I see here, if I do a on the priest, if I do view data, so we had some entities created before, which you can see the default date here. Whereas for the freshly created now, you can also see null. So that way it will give me additional flexibility to skip certain properties when I don't want to give them. So this nullable thing you can apply to almost all kind of columns. When you do not want to store default values like this, age 0 doesn't look good. It should not. In some cases, you must not have wrong values in the DB. It should all be according to the business. Okay, so if somebody has not given a value for it, or if you want to have an option of not giving certain values and maybe entering it later on, so just make it nullable. So when there is no data, a null goes and sits here rather than just leaving it to defaults. So we'll take a look at another few concepts in the next video.